Hello patrons, Rob Caskie, engaging storytelling, and today I want to share a little bit with you about the paintings of a remarkable officer called William Whitlock Lloyd. When I say remarkable, he was far more remarkable as an artist than he was as an officer. A man who has somewhat auspicious beginnings because he grew up at a beautiful country estate with the name of Strancally in County Waterford in Ireland. He was born into a landed family and clearly grew up in very, very good circumstances, was lucky enough to attend Eton and move on from there to Magdalen College at Oxford. He unfortunately never covered himself with glory at Magdalen College. He was known to be quite a disruptive student, missed an awful lot of his lectures, tried to resume his studies and never passed the preliminary examination and was barred from continuing his studies at Oxford. Well, anyway, as was the way with many of the wealthy youngsters in the United Kingdom at the time, he was lucky enough to secure a commission in the 24th Regiment of Foot. The 24th Regiment of Foot had, in the earlier days, recruited in Ireland, and they had quite a strong Irish connection and quite a lot of Irish soldiers within their ranks. And he joined up as a young man in the 24th Regiment of Foot and was lucky enough to come out to South Africa with his great friend, another lieutenant called Heaton, on the Balmoral Castle, and they ended up in the Eastern Cape for the tail end of the 9th Frontier War, but were too late to see any action in the Eastern Cape. And we then moved from there up into KwaZulu-Natal for the looming war with the mighty Zulu nation. Now, it would be fair to say that William Whitlock Lloyd was to spend considerable time at a fort and barricaded farm shed called Helpmekaar, which is on the top of the Biggersberg Escarpment. The Biggersberg Escarpment is at 5,000 feet above sea level, and if viewed from the air, looks like a very long, thin, elongated figure of 8. And in the middle, at the narrowing, there's a pass to ascend and descend the mighty Biggersberg Range. Now, the pass in days gone by was considered to be too steep to attempt with a single team of oxen. So when travelers and settlers and so forth would arrive at the base of the Biggersberg, they would have to wait for another group to arrive with their wagons and their oxen, and then they'd pull one wagon over the pass with a double team of oxen and then go back for the second wagon, hence the name in Afrikaans of Helpmekaar, help each other. Now, at 5,000 feet above sea level, the climate is far more healthy up there than it is at the lower climes, but unfortunately a lot of the incoming troops coming in from the United Kingdom at the tail end of the Eastern Cape campaign were very quick to succumb to the vagaries of fever, enteric, typhoid or dysentery, bearing in mind that the Anglo-Zulu War was preceded by 3 years of drought, so water was in short supply. Obviously hygiene was an issue, fresh drinking water was an issue, and many of their men got sick with enteric, typhoid or dysentery. They called it fever, and fever affected a huge number of men who were stationed up at Helpmekaar, so much so that eventually the salutary firing over the grave when a man who died was buried was banned. That custom was abandoned because it had such a terrible psychological effect on the men in the sanatorium with fever, knowing that they indeed may be the next to be buried. So whilst he was stationed up at Helpmekaar, we see very little painting from this remarkable artist, sadly. He was just too sick to get out and to paint. So a little bit about the background. The paintings created by William Whitlock Lloyd during the Anglo-Zulu War, and indeed afterwards, ended up in the family library of Strancally Castle. William was to have 2 children, a daughter called Winifred, and a son called Percival or Percy. Percy inherited the estate upon the death of his father at age only 41 in 1897, William Whitlock Lloyd was obviously a keen gardener, and he was pruning trees in the garden of Strancally Castle when he fell. The coroner's report says he fell from 20 feet. That's all academic. How high he fell from doesn't matter. He cracked his head very badly and apparently succumbed to a cerebral hemorrhage, and the estate fell into the hands of Percy. And Percy lived a somewhat deleterious life. He very quickly frittered away the family fortunes. His first wife walked out on him. He drank heavily and ended up marrying a servant girl who was famous for having stripped in one of the local bars, and succumbing to the cold, she got pneumonia, from which she eventually died. Well, eventually the castle would be sold to members of another family, and as time went on, the contents of the castle were sold, including the contents of the library. In the interim, his daughter Winifred, who was not fortunate enough, as was the custom at the time, to inherit much in terms of the estate or the castle, she had kept these incredibly valuable and sentimental paintings of her father, who had died at only 41 years of age. And she became very friendly with a neighboring family called the Beechers. And the Beecher family were incredibly kind to Winifred. And Winifred, in old age, in fact she was well into her 70s, when she moved away from County Waterford and Ireland, she handed over as a token of her gratitude to the Beecher family this folder containing the paintings of William Whitlock Lloyd. If you're interested in the minutiae of the story, and I hope you are, it is sad to consider that the books of that great library were sold on auction to a neighbouring farmer for the sum of £2, and many of those books were used as bedding for his pigs. They had in the interim been stored in a dairy and being exposed to huge damp and mould, and as a result the damage to this wonderful collection of books was extreme. But the paintings of William Whitlock Lloyd had survived. Now the Beechers had these paintings in their home, and eventually, around the year 2000, decided to send a couple of the paintings to my great mentor and friend, David Gray Rattray. David Rattray was known as probably the finest storyteller of his age in the world, certainly given that accolade by the British press, a man who was tragically murdered in January of 2007, aged only 48. And David had this brown envelope with a few paintings in it, received by registered post, lying in his library for some time. Being a busy man, he never opened them. And when he eventually opened the envelope and these paintings fell out onto the floor, David said he looked at them lying on the floor and the hair in the back of his neck stood up, because he could see immediately that this was probably some of the most accurate and important artwork to come out of the Anglo-Zulu War. And he immediately contacted the Beechers and said he wanted to see the remains of this incredible collection of about 114 watercolors, along with around 20 pencil and pen sketches. And there was no doubting, with David's knowledge of the area and of the war, that the paintings were photographically accurate from an artist's point of view. And we very quickly realized in our examination of the sites that Lloyd painted that he loved elevation. But one of the first landmarks that David wanted to try and identify was not all that far from Fugitives Drift Lodge, where we were based and worked. A place that Lloyd called on his painting the Midday Halt. And the Midday Halt was a place in the Opoko Valley, which is not far from the Itiotiosi Valley and the Itiotiosi River, where the Prince Imperial of France indeed would be killed in that fated ambush situation on the 1st of June of 1879. And most interesting is that the Midday Halt was not far from a fort that they called Fort Newdigate. Now, I don't know how clearly it is shown in terms of the camera, but here is the Midday Halt, this pile of rocks. Lying in front of it is the company of Lloyd in their bright blue tunics and their red their bright blue woolen trousers and their red serge tunics, lying around, probably wishing for something cool to drink, wishing, of course, for some shade. There were no shade or trees around at the Anglo-Zulu War. They've come about largely as a result of overgrazing and overburning. And David and I were searching for this place called the Midday Halt in the Upoko Valley. And we kept trying to convince ourselves that the pile of rocks that we'd found and identified were the site that Lloyd had painted. And when we got back and downloaded the photographs and looked at them on the screen and looked at them, comparing the images we had with Lloyd's original painting, we realized that we were wrong. We certainly had not found the right spot, so we immediately returned to that spot and moved up and down the valley looking for the right orientation and the right pile of rocks that Lloyd had painted. And eventually the clincher was that off to the right of the pile of rocks is a big rock, very distinctively shaped, and you can see in our photograph the very clear same rock on the right hand side of the group and the pile of rocks at Midday Halt. And when we were able to piece together the accuracy of Lloyd's painting at only age 23, with the ground as it stood 130 years later, we realized the incredible skill and ability of this artist. And with that, our enthusiasm grew enormously to try and find and identify more of the spots that Lloyd had painted. And up at Helpmachar, on top of the escarpment, very nearby, is a waterfall called Eweni, a beautiful, beautiful waterfall with a fine pillar of rock standing up adjacent to the cliffs of that waterfall. And Lloyd had obviously sat down one day and painted the pillar of rock too beautifully, as was his way, incredibly accurate, and even on it there are a number of rock hyrexes or rock dassies sunning themselves. So we went up to the waterfall to have a look around. We identified the spot within seconds. Here indeed is the pillar of rock as we photographed it, and do you know that when we got there were rock hyrexes sunning themselves as they had done at the time of his painting 130 years earlier. There were these incredible realizations as this project began to develop, because David, with his knowledge and his reputation as the doyen of the Anglo-Zulu War storytelling, that if he ever was to produce a book, it had to be good. He knew that everyone would want to find holes and shortcomings in his documentary. So David began to work on a script to accompany these paintings to create this book. It would be fair to say that the script took David 4 years. David is one of the most incredible wordsmiths I've ever met, a man with a quite uncanny ability to paint a picture through words, and his use of the English language is absolutely exquisite. And through a process of elimination, he ended up with an editor, a delightful English woman called Eleanor Mary Cadell. And Eleanor Mary and David worked on this script for some years before it would finally be put together alongside the paintings of William Whitlock Lloyd. And you're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this. I'm telling you all this because Lloyd's great friend, as I mentioned earlier, was Heaton. Heaton had kept a detailed diary in terms of his experiences during the Anglo-Zulu War. So it was very easy for us to put ourselves in the shoes of Lloyd and Heaton, traveling around Zululand, looking for the places that Lloyd had indeed painted. And we knew exactly what they were doing on that day, where the column was moving to, where patrols were moving to, the formation of the camp, and so forth. And there are some times where Lloyd's paintings contain a great deal of humor. For example, the evening cook at Fort Nolala down on the Umfolozi River, preparing the evening meal when Zulu snipers began to snipe at the men in the camp from the other side of the Umfolozi. And this man, grabbing his rifle, he positions himself behind the three-legged pot in which he's preparing the evening meal and is firing back over the pot at the Zulus on the other side of the river. Now, this photograph that I have put on the table for memory's sake and because it's very special to me is a picture of David Rattray and myself taken in the middle of the Umfolozi River, where Fort Nolelo is situated, where the British were on one side of the river and the Zulus were on the other, in preparation for the final awful battle of Ulundi that saw the Zulu army finally smashed on the 4th of July of 1879. And yet it took a further 7 weeks before the British were finally able to capture the king. So successfully, his subjects were hiding him, and he was finally captured in a quite unusual situation on the 28th of August of 1879. And David Rattray is kind enough in the preface to this book to say that the journeys we made traveling around Zululand looking for the sites of Lloyd's paintings were some of the happiest times of his life. And you know, David and I had worked together for some years at the time of the research and the inclusion of sites for this book. And they really were the most magnificent times. We could free ourselves from the pressures of the lodge and guests and lecturing and trying to run a business. And we could be just two incredibly excited fellows with a deep interest and love of Zulu history and the Anglo-Zulu War, trying to find places painted by William Whitlock Lloyd during the War of 1879 and photograph them accurately from a position that he had painted from to try and represent the scene 130 years on. And do you know, oftentimes we were able even to find the rock that we are certain William Whitlock Lloyd sat on during the painting of his scene. And you must understand the complexities of all this. He would not have had the time to paint a scene in detail with all the color, as you see in these magnificent paintings. He would have had to sketch the scene in pencil and have a key regarding the colors that he would fill in given time back in camp. Given that complexity of technique, you've got to understand the detail and the memory, the visualization of William as he traveled around Zululand and would then return to camp to fill in the colors on his painting, remembering the color of the vegetation, the veld, the sky, the clouds, his fellow soldiers in these remarkable scenes. Now, this book was put together. David pre-sold a huge number of copies to pay for the publication and the printing of the book. And the book was on its way to him in a truck from Cape Town when he realized that the contents of the truck were not fully insured. So David, being David Rattray, asked the truck to go back to Cape Town whilst he finalized insurance for the contents for these valuable books. And when the truck was making its way back to Fugitives Drift Lodge with the fully insured contents of these books, David Rattray was tragically murdered on the 26th of January 2007. So it's with great melancholy and poignancy that I remind you, as my valued followers, patrons and friends on this platform, that David Rattray saw this book but never saw a final copy. He never saw it printed and bound, and he also was not able to sign one of these books for the benefit of purchasers and interested clients. There were beautiful leather-bound collector's editions made, along with this, the more regular edition for sale, which is still on sale from Fugitives Drift Lodge. But David Rattray never saw a completed book and was never to sign one copy. And I think as one of the legacies that we have of David Rattray, and indeed of William Whitlock Lloyd, who died aged 41, you recall David died aged 48, this book is a tremendous testimony and tribute to these two great men. One, the doyen of the Anglo-Zulu War, the other, the painter and artist who recorded these scenes with such sensitivity and such accuracy. And I hope you've enjoyed a little bit of information about William Whitlock Lloyd, the creation of this book, and the tremendous times that David Rattray and I had driving all over Zululand in his white Toyota Hilux bakkie looking for sites. Do you know, at one scene we were driving up the side of a mountain looking for the site of elevation that Lloyd had sat upon for his painting, and all I could see ahead of me was blue sky. We were in four wheel drive, low range. And David Rattray turned to me, he was driving, and calmly said, Caskie, if anything goes wrong, you're responsible. And we had these little moments of banter and great humour when we got up to the spot where Lloyd had assumed for that scene. There was a great Rinkhals cobra up there, fairly dangerous South African snake. David loves snakes, and we wondered whether snakes had in fact inhabited that area. I'm sure they had at the time of Lloyd. But I hope you've enjoyed this little story, and will continue to join me for other stories about these and other matters. Thank you very much.